Comenzar con las actividades propiamente académicas del coloquio y bueno, para esto es para mí un honor presentar a nuestra conferencista magistral, la doctora Niki Kasumi Clements, quien nos va a presentar el día de hoy una conferencia que se titula Hacia una ontología histórica de nosotros mismos. Y bueno, quiero hacer una brevísima reseña curricular académica de ella. Niki Kasumi Clements es profesora asociada de religión de la cátedra G. Jackson, con nombramiento honorario en el Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad de Rice en Houston, en Estados Unidos. Es especialista en la obra de Michel Foucault, la filosofía moderna y el ascetismo cristiano antiguo y tardío, que se reúne en su monografía Science of Aesthetic Self de 2020. Y bueno, a partir de su investigación sobre el Fondo Foucault en la Biblioteca Nacional de Francia desde 2019, está completando 2 libros sobre la serie de Historia de la Sexualidad de Foucault que abarcarían los años de 1974 a 1984. Es integrante, rectora del Centro Michel Foucault, un nombramiento reciente que acaba de recibir. Fue investigadora invitada en 2024 por la Fundación Maison des Sciences de l'Homme, la Fundación Casa de las Ciencias del Hombre en París, y es coinauguradora del Seminario Foucault en la Academia Estadounidense de Religión. Es coeditora del volumen Foucault Confessions, Confesiones de Foucault, con James Foucault, Daniel Witch, y también ha publicado sobre Foucault, Juan Casiano, la hermenéutica, la ciencia cognitiva y la ética médica. El día de hoy tenemos el honor de que nos acompañe para esta conferencia. Con esta brevísima presentación, antes de cederle la palabra, bueno, les comentaría un poco la cuestión técnica para que todos estemos enterados. Niki va a presentar su conferencia en inglés. En la pantalla que tenemos de este lado de la sala vamos a tener la traducción al español. Y cuando Niki, con su presentación de PowerPoint que tiene en la parte de atrás, se apoya en ella alguna precisión, nuestras traductoras Gabriela y Citlali nos van a apoyar para hacer alguna precisión. Si nosotros queremos hacer una pregunta al final de la conferencia, al final de la intervención de Niki, bueno, pues contaremos también igualmente con el apoyo de ellas para que ustedes formulen la pregunta en español. Bueno, si alguien la quiere formular en inglés, puede hacerlo también, o en francés. Niki habla perfecto francés, entonces, bueno, puede hacerlo en cualquiera de sus 2 idiomas, pero si prefiere hacerla en español, bueno, contaremos con el apoyo de nuestras traductoras. Entonces, bueno, con este brevísimo preámbulo, le cedo la palabra a Niki Kasumi Clements.
It's such an honor to be here, to be invited, to be a participant in this community that you've been creating over time. Juan Kwamba, who I had the honor of meeting in Paris this summer at the Bibliothèque Nationale, has been doing an extraordinary feat here, bringing together not only so many institutions that support this colloquium, but so many people. Amongst them, it's Juan himself, Lupita Matus, Jorge Vasulis, Gunnar Prado, Edgar Salvador Sanubria, Sergio Espinosa, Julieta Piña, Alfonso Villa, Azucena Pallavicini, Gustavo, Carlos De Piero, Elena Mejia, Ariadna Del Valle, Luis Ortiz, Karina Salazar. It's important to recognize the names because the labor that goes into these kinds of events is so hidden and subtle and real. So I thank you all for the honor of being here, as well as for all of the work that you've done to make this possible.
Gracias. Es un gran honor estar aquí, ser invitada a esta gran comunidad que han creado. A Juan ya tengo mucho tiempo de conocerlo, nos conocimos en París en el verano, ha hecho un gran trabajo uniendo estas instituciones y bueno, todas las personas que he nombrado son nombres importantes, es importante reconocer el trabajo porque normalmente es un trabajo que está escondido, entonces es un gran honor estar con ustedes.
Well, okay, the talk that I'm giving today is based on 5 years of my research in the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. It's the site Richelieu, where you have 6 different collections for the Foucault archives. They're massive, they're complex, they are prolix. They are not very well organized, there are errors in the inventory as well as in the boxes themselves, which are chaos. So what I've been doing over the last 5 years is to make order out of Foucault's last decade, the last decade where he's writing the history of sexuality, so that I can give to other researchers the ability to go into the archives themselves, better navigate what is in there, and to take up a critical as well as charitable approach to Foucault's work today. My own work has been based on the collaborations with so many people around the world, many at the Centre Michel Foucault, which is also a very generous sponsor for today. And I want to recognize Federico and Ariane Scorsini, 2 other speakers who will be talking the next 2 days, Philippe Chevalier, Jim Fabian, Orazio Herrera, Daniele Lorenzini, Henri-Paul Fouchot, Sandra Boranger, Laurie Laffer, Federico Testa, Stuart Eldon, Philippe Sabot, Judy Calvel, Augustin Colombo, Fabien Bougère, Gabriel Pochavsky, and Laurence Lepra. So many more, but their work is in the background of everything that I say today. So it looks simple, this narrative, but it's really based on decades of work, both sustaining the legacy and relevance of Foucault, and also taking up today the possibilities that are now only possible through the archives and through the labor of so many individuals.
En 5 años de trabajo que tengo haciendo todo esto, pues ha sido un gran trabajo que no nada más es mío, es un trabajo que ha sido básicamente poner orden en todo este inventario que se tiene en la última década de trabajo de Foucault durante esta historia de la sexualidad. Ha sido un trabajo que ha tenido un enfoque muy crítico, ha colaborado muchísima gente, toda la gente que mencioné. Es muy importante porque su trabajo realmente está detrás de bambalinas. Es un trabajo que es muy grande, no es fácil organizar todos estos archivos, entonces estoy muy agradecida y es lo que voy a presentar, estos últimos 5 años de trabajo.
A final note to say that there's also a massive international conference happening in Brazil this very same week. And so I find it very striking that in this year of celebrations for Foucault, this World Congress, 40 years after, we have displaced the center of Foucault from France and even from Brazil now to Mexico, here in Morelia. So I'm very grateful for you all being here, as well as for our hosts for convening this exceptional event.
Justo en este momento se está llevando a cabo una conferencia en Brasil acerca de este mismo tema de Foucault. Entonces es muy importante que este año es una gran celebración donde se unen Francia, Brasil y ahora también México, aquí en Morelia. Entonces estoy muy agradecida de estar aquí.
Gracias, Gabriela. In his 1984 article, Qu'est-ce que la lumière?, Michel Foucault reflects on the iconic 1784 essay by Immanuel Kant. Yet, as usual, chez Foucault, he uses this as an occasion to develop his own thoughts about the work of philosophy. He says, I will therefore characterize the philosophical ethos specific to the critical ontology of ourselves as a historical practical test, une épreuve, of the limits that we can overcome, and therefore as the work of ourselves on ourselves as free beings. Foucault here crystallizes his own aspirations for the work of philosophy as reflecting on our present in order to navigate our limits. Yet the limits of our episteme need not remain the limits of our world. Instead, we can recognize the contingency of our norms, institutions, and practices by putting it to the historical practical test. Now, Foucault is best known as the philosopher of power, as Time magazine anointed him in 1981, who identifies how we behave, as Vanity Fair put it in 1983. His most cited works include Discipline and Punish, both at the prison, The Subject and Power, published in 1982, yet likely written years before. So how does Foucault come to reframe philosophy in relation to this Kantian construction of free beings? My answer today is born from 5 years of analyzing his archives at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, where we can see, really for the first time, Foucault's own archival and conceptual shifts in his last decade. Most strikingly for this critical ontology of ourselves is how Foucault conceptually develops 3 analytical axes for understanding human experience: the axis of knowledge, the axis of power, the axis of ethics. Foucault identifies these 3 axes as large domains that are both differentiated and co-imbricating. The first domain treats the relation of mastery over things. We can read this domain as Foucault's concentration in his 1960s masterworks, Le mot et les choses, The Order of Things, and the Archaeology of Knowledge. Here, he treats discourse as productive of what scientific, medical, linguistic, and economic orders will then present themselves as natural and objective. This axis is correlated with Foucault's attention to knowledge, to savoir, produced through rational discourse to the exclusion of the irrational and mad who challenge this order. The second domain, the relation of actions over others. This is clearest in Foucault's 70s works, Discipline and Punish, as well as History of Sexuality, Volume 1. This axis is correlated with his elaboration of power relations, to pouvoir, which structure the success of certain discourses of knowledge to reinforce and normalize certain power relations. The third domain treats the relations to oneself. That is how our subjects not only shaped and therefore limited in their available ways of acting in relation to dominant norms, but also capable of changing their relation to power and knowledge to challenge their operations. This is most evident in his 1980s works, History of Sexuality, Volume 2 and 3. This is the axis that elaborates ethics, l'éthique. A historical ontology of ourselves is how I describe what Foucault gradually forges through his oeuvre, where over the last decade of his life, he comes to articulate the inner relation between these 3 axes in describing human experience. The historical ontology of ourselves, Foucault continues, must respond to an open series of questions. It takes up an undefined number of inquiries that we can multiply and specify as much as we want, but they will all respond to the following systematization. How are we constituted as subjects of knowledge? How are we constituted as subjects who exert or submit to relations of power? How are we constituted as moral subjects of our actions? Foucault gradually comes to see how his earlier work on just power and knowledge had foreclosed the possibility for ethical self-relations that might disrupt and challenge their operations. So as he forges this historical ontology of ourselves, he comes to diagnose how we are constituted as subjects of knowledge, power, and ethics. As he himself reflects back from his first 1984 lecture at the Collège de France, connecting together modes of verediction, techniques of governmentality, and practices of the self is basically what I've always been trying to do. Now, we know Foucault protests too much, so don't trust him on this. But he's looking back to 1984 and making this synthesis that's deeply important to what he sees the stakes of his own analysis to be. Modes of verediction is how he comes to redescribe knowledge, asking what is construed as true instead of false. Techniques of governmentality is how he comes to redescribe power, asking how are subjects shaped as normal instead of abnormal. Practices of the self is how he comes to describe ethics, as operating alongside verediction and governmentality, asking how is a relation to self possible through which we can take up practices of self-formation even against dominant norms. Foucault comes to understand the imbrication of these 3 axes of experience over his last decade in ways that refuse any periodization that isolates knowledge to his 60s work, power to his 70s, and ethics to his 80s. These axes instead emerge as different foci that interlace between these inquiries over time. These conceptual shifts come together for Foucault as he writes and rewrites his History of Sexuality series, begun in 1974 and left incomplete on his death in 1984. Looking back from 1984, Foucault can see how he was constructing this historical practical test by asking questions of different times and contexts in order to identify how we have been shaped as confessing subjects obsessed with sexual identity today. And this test helps us question the limits of how we think about sexuality today. This is a story I'll sketch. It's a strange story because despite history of sexuality being the constant for Foucault's last decade, he significantly changes the series' materials, methods, and concepts. It goes well beyond the initial problematic, the construction of sexuality and modernity through the axes of power and knowledge, and comes to see the necessity of questions of ethics for understanding how we behave and how we come to consciousness of ourselves. Part one of my talk today addresses how he comes to construct a critical ontology of his present by analyzing constructions of sexuality in the 19th century as emerging from a conflation of confession and the flesh in the 16th to 17th century confessors. This is the first block up there. Gabriel, if you can explain. This map constructed over time. It's basically a single map of the archives from the last 10 years of Foucault's life. In red, you can identify the boxes, sometimes the folders I also specify. And this is basically the mind map. I'm happy to send it to anyone. It'll also be a part of this small book that I'm finishing that will be coming out next year. So it's complex, clearly, but these are also the different volumes Foucault is constructing over time. Now we have titles. We also have massive chapter drafts in the archives that I've been reconstituting, along with Henri Foucault, Foucault's nephew, as well as Philippe Chevalier and many others. So it's a very exciting time to see so much from the archives coming out and being published. And my hope is that this material, too, will be accessible to us all.
Este mapa que ustedes ven aquí es un mapa de los archivos de los últimos 10 años, en lo que está en rojo. A veces pues se identifican las carpetas. Básicamente este es el mapa. Estoy pues feliz de compartirlo si es así. Es parte de un libro que estoy terminando y que saldrá el siguiente año. Es complejo claramente, pero también pues ven los diferentes volúmenes que pues se han hecho en diferentes momentos. Tenemos los títulos, también tenemos borradores de los archivos, de los capítulos masivos, de los archivos que estoy reconstruyendo. Es un momento muy emocionante ver que pues tanto de los archivos sale a la luz y mi esperanza es que este material pues sea accesible para todos.
Muchas gracias. Part two then moves from early modern confessors in this first bit to the practices of pastoral power, confession, and spiritual direction in early Christianity, notably between the 2nd and 5th centuries. This is really the Foucault of Les Ouvres de la Chair that was published in 2018, quickly translated into Spanish, as well as 12 other languages. Part three then treats how Foucault moves from late ancient Christianity to explore the self-mastery of ethical relations in high empire Greco-Roman philosophers, and then to the use of pleasure in ancient Greek philosophers and medics. From the 20th century back to the 5th century BCE, Foucault undertakes this critical ontology by genealogically tracing the histories of practices, of conduct, as they shape the conditions for how we are constituted today. So, to the organizing theme of this conference, we can thus read Foucault's archives in the light of how he works towards a historical ontology of his present. This story tells us both how Foucault comes to his theorization of ethics alongside power knowledge and his identification of human experience, notably in the experience of oneself as a sexual being, and how he works towards this historical ontology of his present by parsing the practices, mechanisms, and institutions undergirding modern subjection. And in this historical ontology, there are two unknown volumes. It's not very clear, is it? No, I'll explain it all. So there are two unknown volumes that only exist in the BNF archives, but that we're trying to bring to the light of day. The first helps Foucault diagnose how we got to the present, That's his book on the early modern confessors, La chair, le corps. The second helps him see how we might challenge our own selves to do differently today. That's Le gouvernement de soi des autres, the government of self and others. I therefore take us through the archives in order to better understand his historical ontology of ourselves, with the goal of illuminating the work that he took to be so important that we ourselves can continue and critique. So in 1974, Foucault begins his History of Sexuality series as an attempt to analyze the mechanisms of modern disciplinary power and the taxonomies of scientific, psychiatric, legal, and economic knowledge that support them. Foucault begins his series with the well-known Volume 1, La Volonté de Savoir, known in English translation as An Introduction. According to Daniel Defer, Foucault's partner, Foucault started work on this volume on August 26, 1974, the very day that he completed Discipline and Punish, Birth of the Prison. These volumes then unsurprisingly share a focus on techniques of power productive of modern subjects. Foucault was hard at work trying to identify the historical conditions for the emergence of strategies of subjection in modern carceral society. Here, sexuality becomes a central strategy of subjection during the 19th century. As some readers will know, Foucault originally conceived his History of Sexuality series in 6 volumes. He concludes Volume 1 in August 1976 and introduces his plan for 5 volumes to follow. Foucault notes Volume 2, the following volume, La chair, le corps, which rules for putting sex into discourse in the Catholic and Reformed pastoral. Volumes 3 through 6 would treat different 19th century normalizing strategies for naming and regulating subjects through their sexuality. Volume 3 on children's masturbation, Volume 4 on hysterical women, Volume 5 on queer men, and Volume 6 on the racialization of population. These 5 projected volumes would have focused on the construction of deviant and dangerous individuals against whom society must be defended. Common to his research for these 6 volumes in the History of Sexuality is Foucault's intense interest in penal systems, in their historical development, technologies, and effects. To understand these modern techniques of confession and subjection, Foucault notes, we must look to their point of formation in the penitential practices of medieval Christianity. This is why he goes back to Christianity. The mechanisms of truth-telling and confession come to fuel modern disciplinary practices, even though their religious roots are covered over by 19th century scientific, medical, and economic discourses. Volume 1 thus introduces Catholic confession in continuity with modern psychoanalysis, where the therapist, as modern priest, extracts the truth of the subject as modern supplicant. Although Foucault is said to have destroyed his manuscript for La chair, le corps, his research for this volume is present in reading notes and copious chapter drafts in the BNF archives. He wrote almost 1,000 pages for this book on the professors over about 5 years. And so his research for this volume is not only present in the archives, but we can see these indices in the works that have been published. Between 1974 and 1976, Foucault's research for Volume 2, Flesh and Body, focuses on confessional practices in the early modern struggles of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. He's even describing Luther and the other Protestant reformers in the archives. Here, truth-telling as religious veridiction comes to structure juridical and penal practices more generally. After Volume 1 is published in 1976, the story becomes interesting. Foucault tries to follow the thread of confession in the 16th through 18th century confessions of the flesh, the direction of conscience, and disciplinary practices of assujettissement as he drafts this Volume 2. It's really this obsession of his, this huge, massive volume. He writes more for Volume 2 than he does even for the Ancients. Foucault frames Volume 2 as setting up the logic for the other 4 volumes, where Christian technologies of sex become concerns of the state in 4 axes. Pedagogy, regulating children's masturbation; medicine, regulating women's psychiatry and physiognomy; the law, regulating people's gender in a binary of male and female; and biology, economics, regulating population through sexual reproduction. We can see this material anticipated for the other volumes in the History of Sexuality, with archival reading notes and chapters developed particularly for Volumes 2, 3, and 5. The 5th one is partially included in Foucault's introduction to Herculine Barbin. So So there are these indices that we can find in both the Collège de France lectures as well as in some of Foucault's other publications. There's considerable overlap between volumes 2 and 3 in particular, with penitence regulating sexual acts and confession as a strategy of subjection. La Querelle des Enfants has 5 very developed chapter drafts in manuscript form in boxes 51 and 64 at the BNF. And yet Foucault would leave these to the side and continue redrafting his much more boring book on the confessors. Foucault writes particularly on the great penitentialization of the soul in the 16th and 17th centuries, where confessors established a causistic of mollesse and delectation. It's concupiscence here that emerges as the guilty element, where will, pleasure, and ejaculation are combined. Foucault had a hard time with these volumes. In a letter to Simeon Wade of the famous LSD trip in California, he writes in January 1976, "I had a rather bad time last fall. I could not come through my book about sexual repression. I hope that I now know how to work it out." That year, Foucault indeed gets his grounding, rewriting volume 1. He then continues rewrites of volume 2 between 1976 and 1979 as he charts a line of influence from the 16th century works of Antoine de Florence's Confessionem Perfugium to the 18th century works of Alphonse Vigori. Although there is no complete volume draft in the archives, it's possible to trace through the BNF Fond Foucault a general structure for his volume on the confessors. Though tedious, it's important to trace the volume through the archives so you can note which boxes and folders might interest you in your own research. So in an introductory chapter, Foucault frames this volume as the, quote, first in a series dedicated to the constitution of a sexual science, the Scientia Sexualis, in the 18th and 19th centuries. He notes that the first part of the volume would present a, quote, history in Catholic practice of this strange obligation to speak the truth out loud to another person. The second part of the volume would follow schematic elements on confession and sins of the flesh from Louis Habert. From the first part, we can see a table of contents and partial chapter drafts. Philippe Chevalier has also been working on reconstructing this volume, and so there's really a lot here. If you want to follow up any of these inquiries, you can let us know, and we'll put you, as we have already with Juan, been doing that work.
Se está reconstruyendo, se está trabajando en esta reconstrucción de este volumen para, si quieren hacer algún seguimiento de todo esto, pueden hacernos algunas consultas, nos pueden hacer saber y nosotros pues podemos ayudarles a tener esta información.
So you can see basically in these tables of contents, the focus is on the production of sin, the way that concupiscence becomes a problem. Basically, how does it become a problem to have desire? This is Foucault's big question. So by following titles, references, and concepts, we can see how Foucault is developing his critical reading of confession by moving from the 7th to the 18th centuries, because he keeps building this volume out. Despite the sweeping chronological range, Foucault maintains the problematic of the confessions of the flesh, les aveux de la chair, which is language he uses throughout these drafts. The second part of this volume has a very straightforward table of contents and 8 fully elaborated and sequential chapters in manuscript form. This is going to be the easiest part of the volume to publish. Here, he's moving across these drafts, elaborating practices of verediction in the actus veritatis of the confessors, the injunction to say everything, dire vrai, in proof inquiry. Foucault identifies the subject's relation to self, ses rapports à soi, as mediated through ecclesial 16th to 17th century, and then medical, legislative, economic 18th to 19th century authorities that he identifies with disciplinary power. Sexuality becomes gradually produced, according to Foucault, through confessors' attention to a binary of natural and unnatural, foregrounding questions of mollesse and pollutio, extracting secrets of impurity under the rubric of the care of the souls. It's also deeply misogynist. Women are considered the vase, right? The seed can only go in the natural vase. And so there are other interesting elements. If you want to translate that. Can you repeat it? Yeah. It's also deeply misogynist, unsurprisingly, where the materials about women are written in terms of basically the vagina being the natural vase that any kind of semen needs to go into. Okay. It's rather arcane as a concept.
Okay. Pues hay algunos materiales acerca de la mujer, ¿no? Y de cómo la vagina y el semen entra a la vagina. Y bueno, es lo que también pueden encontrar aquí.
So this is the power diagnosis Foucault is after from his History of Sexuality series set up in Volume 1. How then do we get to modern constructions of sexuality as a privileged point of application for the control and production of disciplinary subjects? In 16th to 17th century confessional manuals and their 18th century application, flesh is put into a juridical framework. Foucault notes the transformation from the technology of flesh in classical Christianity, which foregrounds discourse about sex for monastics, pursuing purity, to the reformed pastoral, which renders sex into discourse for everyone. In short, people stop having sex and they start talking about it. So, this is Foucault's problem.
En resumen, la gente dejó de tener relaciones y Foucault pues, empezó a escribir sobre esto, ¿no?
Bueno. A confessional apparatus comes to govern all people in everyday life, where confessing the truth of their sexual desires becomes isomorphic with who they are. The juridical and veridictional come together as one becomes a subject by coming to consciousness of oneself through the confession of their sexual sins. So the relation to self is completely mediated through an authority, as well as through this verbal confession of one's interior desire. Okay. Yeah, read it. Yeah. It's fine. Yes, maybe. I speak off the cuff a lot, but I've been very disciplined in sticking to my text because of the translation.
I was trying to read that.
Yes. No, it's fine. We'll move on. So the confessors then preoccupy Foucault between at least 1974 and 1979 as he drafts and redrafts these materials for Volume 2 in the History of Sexuality. You'll recall that the title was La chair et le corps, Flesh and Body, yet after the 1976 publication of Volume 1, Foucault retitles this volume on the Confessors, Volume 2, Les Œuvres de la chair. This is confusing, of course, because Les Œuvres de la chair is the title for Volume 4 as published in 2018 as a volume not on the early modern, but on the early Christians of the 2nd to 5th centuries. We must go further into the archives to understand how, as Foucault puts power relations to this historical practical test, he drafts not one, but 2 Christian books. This is the retrograde Foucault. People don't know why he was going back into antiquity, but it's even more bizarre why he became so obsessed with the Christians. This is part of my thesis.
Okay. Este es el Foucault más retrógrada. Nadie sabe en realidad pues por qué se fue como al pasado, pero bueno, es algo que sucedió y que es interesante en la historia.
So developing this historical ontology of ourselves, Foucault keeps tracing back 2 main threads, veridiction and juridiction. There's a 3rd thread that emerges in the art of virginity and care of the self, but we'll bracket that for now. His historical practical tests take him back from the 16th to 17th century confessor manuals to the 12th century work leading up to the Lateran Council to the 7th to 8th century penitentials. But he wanted to know before the Catholic Church institutionalized pastoral power, what were the historical practices that preceded it and that it took up. As he explores pastoral power, the early Christian world of confession and the pastor, vis-a-vis Gregory the Great's Liber Pastoralis, and John Cassian's monastic practical tests open up. Between 1979 and 1982, Foucault entirely rewrites Les Œuvres de la chair on the early Christians of the 2nd to 5th centuries. It's a significant change for Volume 2 as the Christian book, where Foucault displaces modern confessors for ancient monastics as the site for the production of confessional practice. Yet we can also see the transition between these 2 Christian books. It's in the introduction to a version of his book on the confessors that Foucault says he wants to quickly sketch 4 lines of continuity between ancient Christianity and the 16th century. He says, before analyzing in some detail the way in which Catholic penance regulated the confessions of the flesh in the 16th and 17th centuries, I would like to hastily sketch some of their broad outlines of this government of men by their truth, as we see them taking shape since antiquity. Just a few elements: direction of conscience in antiquity, the pastorate, the dimorphism, generalization of spiritual art. These are themes that Foucault would continue to explore in early Christianity through 1982 and his redrafting of Les Œuvres de la chair. Instead of finding the mechanisms for 19th century subject formation in 16th and 17th century confessional practices, Foucault's research opens up a much longer and more complex historical ontology of Christian confession, concupiscence, and the flesh. Flesh is a condition of possibility for sexuality when confession is put into a juridical framework, and then modern institutions of psychiatry and medicine. It's interesting that Foucault seems to have started working on early questions just as a quick part of his introduction to the 16th century, asking himself in a Nietzschean fashion if we indeed are Christian, all too Christian. In August 1977, at his family home in Vendouvre, on the account of Daniel Defer, Foucault starts seriously reading early Christian writers, especially Jean Cassien, Augustin, and Tertullian. Problematics of the flesh and pastoral power thread his movements between early modern and late ancient Christianities. After a year sabbatical from 1976 to 1977, Foucault's 1978 Collège de France lectures treat the ancient production of pastoral power through governmentality. His shift from power relations to forms of governmentality is part of how he nuances how he sees the relations of actions over others. With pastoral power and spiritual direction, Foucault sees modes of subjection particular to Christianity from the pastorate's conditions of emergence in early Christianity to its modern articulations. The question is one of omnes et sigulatum, the dynamics of individualization and totalization that Foucault describes in his 1979 Tanner lectures at Stanford University. Yet as Foucault continues to read 4th to 5th century Christian texts, he revises both his series plan and his readings of Christianity. According to Defer, Foucault begins to rewrite Les Œuvres de la Chair in January 1979 on early Christians instead of early modern confessors. On the basis of the intellectual journals of Foucault that I've been consulting, I'd redate this to summer of 1979 after his Collège de France lectures. In November 1979, Foucault also changes his research location from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France to the Bibliothèque de Chasseloup in a Dominican monastery in the 13th arrondissement, where the reading room is no bigger than this room. In this milieu, then, Foucault develops his readings of spiritual direction and truth-telling in late antiquity. And between 1979 and 1980, Foucault drafts his Préhistoire de l'aveu, the prehistory of confession, on penitential and confessional practices in early Christian contexts. Foucault initially reads these ancient texts in order to identify the conditions for the emergence of the Catholic pastoral before their ecclesial organization and institutionalization. While in History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Foucault identifies the triad, power, knowledge, pleasure, where pleasure was a site of resistance to the heteronormatively and reproductively restrictive scientia sexualis. In his work in the early Christians, he identifies a different triad in his historical ontology: power, knowledge, subjectivity, in order to account for the way the relation to self is also taken up in these 2nd to 5th century texts. Departing from his 6-volume plan, that first panel, Foucault analyzes how the flesh and truth-telling become sites of preoccupation well before modern constructions of sexuality. He also analyzes the relation to self as mediated through practices of exmelogesis, truth-telling or truth-showing in penitence, and exagerusis, truth-speaking in confession. By his 1980 Collège de France lectures, Foucault first focuses on Tertullian and exmelogesis as the antecedent to early modern tariffed penance. Changing his focus in March 1980, as Philippe Chevalier argues, exagerusis in Cashin becomes the antecedent to the deciphering of interiority, which is the condition for truth-speaking. As a brief note, Foucault becomes interested in Cashin because he sees Cashin as anticipating 2 names, he says, Descartes and Freud. So Cashin inaugurates interiority.
Okay, Foucault empieza a interesarse en Cassiano, principalmente anticipando que, o anticipa a dos personajes, a Descartes y a Freud.
Gracias. Okay, so the Actus Veritatis, once associated with modern confessors, becomes primarily routed through the exagerusis of Christian desert ascetics. This seems very random. No. Yet, over the year 1980, Foucault drafts material that ends up populating Les Œuvres de la Chair. Particularly interesting are his French drafts for his English seminars he'll give at the New York Institute of Humanities, as well as UC Berkeley in fall 1980. Here, the third dimension of virginity and the art of arts as his care of the self become articulated. This is the opening of sites of resistance in early Christianity that Foucault was interested in.
Esto se abre como un campo de resistencia, o es la apertura a un campo de resistencia en el que el cristianismo primitivo pues se puede observar por primera vez.
Henri Paul Foucault and Daniele Lorenzini have just published Genealogies of Sexuality with Fun, and it's an extraordinary volume that can take you through these lectures. C'est bon. And yet, as Foucault rewrites Les Œuvres de la Chair, he doesn't completely abandon his draft volume on the Confessors. As Foucault would say to Paul Rabinow in 1983, I wrote a study, a first version of a book on sexual morality in the 16th century, where the problem of technologies of the self, the examination of oneself, the care of souls are very important in both Protestant and Catholic churches. In a chapter draft for Les Œuvres de la Chair on the early Christians, Foucault intriguingly notes he will treat, quote, in the following volume, Le Septenaire de l'Élection, how exmelogesis will endure in communities of penitents through the 16th century. This is particularly interesting for understanding how Foucault was tracing his historical ontology of his present through this volume on the Confessors, which would have brought him back to modern strategies of subjection set up in volume 1 of the History of Sexuality. His focus in this volume draft is rather the way the 16th century posed in innumerable ways the problem of government, how to direct the conduct of others, and the Lutheran conception of the flesh and its forms of resistance to Catholic doctrine. So in this one footnote, I found for the first time the title to this weird book on the Confessors that Foucault was planning on, indeed, writing through 1982.
Okay, pues encontré por primera vez el título de este extraño libro sobre los confesores que Foucault planeaba escribir hasta 1992.
So my archival analysis suggests that for a time, Foucault planned the Confessors volume as volume 3, reassembling material he had drafted in the 70s under the heading Tontois. You can even open up your copy of Les Œuvres de la Chair and see how Foucault notes that Augustine's conception of the flesh, having served as a constant reference for the sexual ethic of Western Christianity, will be the starting point of the next study. In his editorial apparatus for Les Œuvres de la Chair, Frédéric Gros suggests, quote, it's not out of the question that for a time Foucault envisaged taking up material worked for La Chair Le Corps to provide a follow-up to Les Œuvres de la Chair. I believe that through October 1982, Foucault planned the Confessors volume as a follow-up to his early Christian book, and if he had been able to fully edit Les Œuvres de la Chair in 1984, he would have had to delete this now obsolete reference. We have then two Christian books that Foucault at least temporarily conceived as completing his history of sexuality and bringing us back to modernity. How then do we end up with volumes 2 and 3 as published on ancient Greek and Roman sexual ethics? As he draws Les Œuvres de la Chair between 1979 and 1982, Foucault establishes an introduction to this volume that sets up Greco-Roman practices as a contrasting foil for early Christian practices. Yet through the influence of his friend and colleague Paul Vane, Foucault gradually recognizes that his original introduction for Les Œuvres de la Chair was rife with cliches on pagan ethics. So this is a practice he will take up serially to write a short introduction and realize he needs to write an entire volume. So this happens 4 times over the last 10 years of his life.
Okay, esta era una práctica que él tenía. Comenzaba escribiendo una introducción muy cortita que después pues, se convertiría en 4 volúmenes diferentes, ¿no? Era algo que él hacía continuamente.
So he continues his historical practical test by thinking about resistance not through pleasure but through ethics. As he rewrites his introduction to Les Œuvres de la Chair in late 1980 and 81, he delves into historical analyses of late antiquity and the High Empire pioneered in the 1970s by Paul Vane, Pierre Hadot, and Peter Brown, who were Foucault's direct interlocutors. A series of archived drafts of his introduction to the Christian book, when still volume 2, allow us to see how Greco-Roman texts gradually become central to his history of sexuality. As Foucault revises his introduction for Les Œuvres de la Chair so it is no longer full of cliches, he undertakes a more complex and subtle analysis of the ancient philosophical and medical texts he considers to be powerful influences for Christian forms of life. Foucault submits a full draft of Les Œuvres de la Chair to his editor Pierre Nora at Gallimard in 1982. Yet he asks Nora to defer publication of this volume as he works out a volume on the ancients. As Foucault devotes his last 3 years to monographs on the ancients, he suspends work on his Christian book in order to push his historical ontology further back into antiquity. Foucault comes to see practices of sexual ethics as more continuous than expected between pagan and Christian forms, both participating in a new ethics. Nouvelle éthique indeed becomes the title for what we see in a worn archival folder with the following table of contents. So a new ethics, the measure of pleasure, moral of the elephant, procreation. This is where Foucault becomes obsessed with the mating practices of the elephant. The elephant is the ideal model for conjugal relations that are, basically heteronormative elephant sex. Couple for life, ritually purify, and only do it to reproduce.
Esto es básicamente pues donde Foucault se obsesiona un poco con las prácticas de los encuentros de los elefantes. El elefante es el modelo como ideal para el cónyuge, que son pues heteronormales, ¿no? Y se acoplan de por vida y solo eso. Bueno.
So this is the continuity then between Pliny and the elephant, and François de Sales and the elephant.
Okay. La continuidad del elefante y el...
Pliny.
Pliny.
Pliny. Quelqu'un est ancien? Ouais.
Okay. Y el antiguo, okay. El elefante.
Okay. Well, so Foucault's return to ethics occurs in this historical tracing of practices that show we are not, in fact, Christian, all too Christian, but instead more pagan than we thought. And this is part of a shift in how he sees pleasure, not as a site of resistance, but as navigated in a more traditional way than he could have imagined from his reading of ancient Greek aphrodisia. In the presumed partage, the shared division, what changes is the experience of self, where aphrodisia in ancient Greece and veneria in ancient Rome become transmuted into the flesh, la chair, with the early Christians. The high empire of the first 2 centuries began as the cultural context Foucault uses as a brief frame to understand his 2nd to 5th century Christian texts. However, these texts in Roman philosophy and medicine become a site for Foucault's re-elaboration of the History of Sexuality series. He gives up on tracing his historical ontology of present forms of power relations and governmentality from the early Christians and instead moves backwards to reconsider how sexual ethics might open up different ways of thinking through challenges to modern sexuality. In this period, between 1981 and 1984, Foucault takes up the possibilities of a critique of the force of truth in his own present. And he's on the hunt to reconsider how, from resistance to pleasure to counterconduct to subjectivity, we might come to a different way of describing human experience and sexual ethics. And this gradually leads him to his understanding of ethics vis-a-vis forms of the relation of self to self, not fully constrained by the norms of the time. So while his reintroductions to Les Œuvres de la Chair stresses the continuity between Roman and early Christian practices, Foucault comes to construct a separate volume on the Greco-Roman authors of the High Empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Identifying this volume as this first volume, presumably in his revised History of Sexuality series following Volume 1, Foucault analyzes the relation to self and a new mode of experience through the moralities that pagans and Christians shaped. Deferring Confessions of the Flesh to Volume 3, Foucault develops this new Volume 2 on 2nd and 1st century philosophers and medics, with a focus on the connections between particularly the Stoics and the early Christians. While the early Christians had been his original site for a genealogy of desiring man, Foucault stages imperial Romans as setting the conditions for these practices before the early Christians. His deepening historical ontology of modern morality becomes traced back to the Roman practices that informed early Christian sexual ethics. Foucault analyzes a new ethics in the Greco-Romans that locate practices of sexual monogamy within marriage and strengthening of the themes of austerity. Questions of marriage linking Stoic practices to Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century are particularly important. He most likely started this research for this book on a new ethic in 1981. The research and ideas for this book on Roman sexual ethics gradually take shape and will eventually be published as volume 3, Le Souci de Soi, or Care of the Self. Between 1981 and 1983, this volume on sexual ethics before Christianity is titled L'usage de plaisir, the use of pleasure. And Foucault gradually incorporates ancient Greek material alongside the imperial Romans. In these drafts, Foucault maintains Christianity as a constant reference point for schematizing continuities and departures with ancient technologies of the self, notably through practices of examination and direction of conscience. By August 1983, this volume 2, that now includes the Greco-Romans and the ancient Greeks, was so large that Foucault separated it into 2 volumes. Volume 2, The Use of Pleasure, dedicated to the ancient Greeks, and Volume 3, The Care of the Self, dedicated to the Greco-Romans. Researching and lecturing on ancient Greek and Greco-Roman philosophical and medical texts would occupy Foucault's attention as he kept writing the History of Sexuality series between 1981 and 1984. This attention marks the definitive shift away from the 6-volume version of the History of Sexuality en modernity, including his book on the Confessors, The Seven Folds of Lust, towards a reconfigured series on ancient forms of life. Instead of modern morality, which foregrounds questions of sexuality and obedience, the questions Foucault asks of these ancient practical texts lead him to ethics as a broader category within which questions of sex are embedded. And this is how we can now understand the other material Foucault was developing on the ancient Greeks and Romans. Between 1981 and 1982, Foucault simultaneously turns to questions of ethics separately from questions of marriage and aphrodisia. It's during this period we can identify a surprising addition to Foucault's last monographs, across at least 3, 5, 7 archival boxes. Foucault notes in his 1983 interview with Paul Rabat that he was also developing, quote, a book separate from the sex series on ancient ethics. In the archives, this book is titled Le Gouvernement de Soi et des Autres, and according to Defer, Foucault considered the work ready to be edited. In chapter drafts for this volume, then, Foucault analyzes ancient ethics with attention to care of the self and practices of the self. He also develops how ethical relations in the government of self always involve relations to others. Foucault builds from his analyses, texts, and concepts featured in the 1982 Hermeneutics of the Subject lectures at the Collège de France, probably drafting most of the material for this volume in summer 1982. Frédéric Gross's 2001 exposition of these college lectures help us frame their overlap with the volume, yet no one has treated this material since then. I guess I have. As Foucault builds his argument on ancient ethics as the broader framework for understanding sexual ethics that both volumes 2 and 3 published, he works to unfold the relations between forms of governmentality, technologies of the self, and regimes of truth. We can also better understand Foucault's critical ontology of ourselves developed through his 1983 and 1984 lectures at the Collège de France through the content of this volume, Le Gouvernement de Soi et des Autres. Reading the drafts for this volume alongside his collège lectures illuminates how Foucault develops his thought on critiques of power through different modes of truth-telling. Foucault's exploration of the topic of truth-confessing and truth-telling would be a major undercurrent in his work through 1984, first in relation to sexuality and gradually in relation to parrhesia, this very famous term. As a practice of truth-telling, parrhesia, frankness, becomes a means of challenging forms of political and economic and social domination. And by challenging these forms, they can forge conditions for everyone to better care for themselves. Ethical formation only occurs in relation to others, in these ancient contexts, in relation to one's spiritual director and community members, and ethical practices involve concrete practices of listening, speaking, exercises, meditating, and being in dialogical relation to others. These are the social dimensions of ethics, not as evident in Foucault's published volumes, and for which his work is critiqued as being too focused on the individual, as well as the very silly neoliberal readings. Slide, please. I can defend it. Okay, yet despite the claim that Le Gouvernement de Soi et des Autres was ready to be edited, we do not find a straightforward volume in the archives. Instead, I identify across 5 archival boxes parts of tables of contents, as well as full manuscript and even typescript versions of chapters. I don't present here a definitive table of contents, but I share parts of the volume that Foucault clearly developed in his drafts, so you can follow in the archives what Foucault develops as his understanding of the philosophical ethos specific to the critical ontology of ourselves. So here you can see the focus on basically the art of living, the different ways in which Foucault frames how the care of the self and the arts of living in Le Gouvernement de Soi et des Autres rely on relations to others in 2 important ways. First, Foucault argues for the social fact of how subjects are always constituted in relation to each other and how the truth is produced through these practices, instead of being given in advance as an ontological or epistemological condition. Second, Foucault offers a social possibility for how one can be in relation to others in a way that enables the care of others. The care of self is practice-based, opening up different ways of stylizing one's practices in ways that challenge norms and excesses of power. Shaping one's own practices in departures from dominant norms, 1, requires the training and advice of trusted companions and teachers. 2, shows others how they too might adopt and adapt different practices. And 3, enables the cultivation of a critical perspective that requires speaking out against the injustices of political autocrats. In brief, such practices are not solipsistic and solely focused on the individual. Foucault even briefly attends to Hacia as a relational practice of communal formation, which in fact began with his reading of early Christian dynamics of spiritual direction. Le Gouvernement de Soi des Autres thus helps us address the question of how Foucault's last years of lectures overlap with his History of Sexuality series. The overlap between his Ancient Ethics volume and his last years of research do not end with a shared title for his 1983 and 1984 Collège de France lectures, Le Gouvernement de Soi des Autres, as you'll know. Foucault ends up drawing from his draft of Le Gouvernement de Soi des Autres, incorporating parts from this draft into his History of Sexuality series, volumes 2 and 3. So as he developed his historical, critical ontology of ourselves, Foucault dedicated himself to ethics to push beyond the limits of how we are shaped as subjects, but can also reshape ourselves as free beings through practices of the self, including pleasure in antiquity. Between August 1983 and spring 1984, Foucault would complete and edit volumes 2 and 3. At his death, Foucault left piles of material on his desk. Amongst this material is a folder of corrected proofs for Le Souci de Soi. Amongst the sections he crossed out is an introduction, as usual, of 3 pages, where on the last page Foucault notes the centrality of the culture of self to the ancients. In a footnote, he adds, J'étudierai dans un travail à venir d'autres aspects de cette culture de soi. I will study in a work to come the other aspects of this culture of the self. Volumes 2 and 3 would be published right before Foucault's June 1984 death. Foucault would hand-edit typescripts for Les Œuvres de la Chair as Volume 4, anticipating its publication by the end of the year, yet not having any time to edit Part 3. By this time, neither did he have time to complete Le Gouvernement de Soi des Autres as a work to come. So in order to forge his historical ontology of ourselves and to conclude, Foucault applies his historical practical tests in the 3 movements I've delineated today. The first part treated how Catholic confession shapes modern strategies of subjection in the original 6-volume version of the History of Sexuality. The second part developed how his turn to antecedent confessional and penitential practices in late antiquity opened him up towards a renewed interest in antiquity through the bridge of the High Empire. The third part identified how as he works back to his long-term interest in ancient Greek philosophy, he comes to see that there are different experiences of sex and pleasure and the self that likewise open up a broader inquiry into ethics as an art of living that encodes its own practices, techniques, and critical goals. Foucault's archives give a clear sense of how he works towards a historical ontology of his present. So what kept Foucault working with such rigor and commitment even in the weeks leading up to his death? What were the stakes of his historical ontology of ourselves that he was forging? The first, I would say, is descriptive, to understand where we come from. Foucault develops his History of Sexuality series as a historical practical test. He even develops research for several other volumes in order to undertake this historical ontology of his present. The second is critical, to challenge how things are done in the present. Foucault establishes through these historical, practical inquiries how necessary an ethical axis is to explain how human experience is constituted alongside relations of power, forms of governmentality, and knowledge, regimes of truth. The descriptive and critical projects, like the stakes of these both, are bound together, because only by recognizing the historical conditions for our present can we expose, diagnose, and critically challenge the epistemic and normative limitations through which we ourselves are shaped. For Foucault, this historical ontology describes how modern subjects have become constituted through a long genealogy of historical practices, institutions, and logics. Foucault analyzes the condition of possibility for who we are today through a historical a priori, working from the present back gradually through his analyses of forms of power and the production of knowledge to expose the mechanisms of subjection that are gradually covered over. As he writes the History of Sexuality series between 1974 and 1984, he develops this historical ontology of ourselves in order to expose the practices and logics undergirding institutions of knowledge and power that have covered over the conditions of their constitution in order to appear inevitable, just, and humanizing. With this critical goal of challenging normative operations, the limits we can overcome as free beings, Foucault is after the conditions of possibility for critiquing his own present and doing things differently. Foucault's massive changes to the history of sexuality can thus be schematized as a movement from strategies of subjection to an ongoing inquiry in the care of the self. The decade-long unfolding of his history of sexuality from the 6-volume series, including La chair, le corps, le croisade des enfants, to Les aveux de la chair, first on the confessors and then on the ancients, to l'usage de plaisir, first on the Greco-Romans and then including the ancient Greeks, to le gouvernement de soi et des autres, though conceived as separate from the sex series, traces a conjunction between the truth of being governed and government as a political and ethical question relating self and others. Departing from his modern inquiries into subject formation and disciplinary subjectivity, Foucault analyzes the capacity for self-formation alongside the realities of subject formation. Developing his historical practical test allows Foucault to see the contingency of current norms, institutions, and practices, looking at different ways that self-relations have been possible, different relations to truth have been articulated, different ways of being governed have been forged. He exposes the mechanisms in his historical ontology in order to see their dangers as the precondition for critically challenging their operations in his own present. That Foucault would not close the arc of his history of sexuality in 1984 perhaps signals a lack of time with his impending death. What changes might he have made to part 3 of Les aveux de la chair? Would he have continued his work en le septenaire de la lecture? Or would he have returned to le gouvernement de soi des autres and his attention to ethical practices of truth-telling and parousia featured in his 1983 and 84 lectures? Perhaps he would have resolved the tension in his History of Sexuality volumes as published. On the one hand, we have obligations of truth-telling and the genealogy of the desiring subject. On the other hand, the arts of living and ethics as self-relation and relation to others. This is not the end of the story. Rather, I present this panorama in order to open the archives to further inquiry, to continue to refine analyses of these prolix materials. Foucault worked over an entire decade to produce this. So there's no definitive way to understand final Foucault. However, better understanding Foucault's intellectual trajectory between 1974, when he began writing his series, and 1984, when his final publication seemed to close the series, allows us to better understanding his shifting methods, conceptualizations, and problematizations. In Foucault's critical ontology of ourselves, it's important to both parse and see the interrelation between the narrative he constructs, the methods he forges, and the stakes of his inquiry for present critique. It's even, I wager, imperative for engaging Foucault's work more broadly to think differently rather than legitimating what is already known. I therefore offer my description and analysis of his genealogical method and historical ontology of his present in order to open up Foucault's archives and the tools he honed over his whole life. And I invite us to challenge and critique his own critical ontology as a history of his present, not our own 40 years later. What are the limits we need now overcome as the work of ourselves on ourselves as free beings? Foucault gives us no answers, only methods and concepts that we can critique and take up. That's why I titled this talk Towards a Historical Ontology of Ourselves, because Foucault's present is not our own. We're now better equipped, 40 years later, in part through the critical discourses that Foucault's own work has shaped, and in part through the international spread of the work currently being undertaken. We're more connected now. We can work globally to see both how Foucault's work has been an enduring influence and how his readings are insufficient to address the complexity of our current moment. Thank you.
Bueno, pues en este momento sería la ocasión para... Bueno, pasamos ahora a este segundo momento de la conferencia magistral, en el cual iniciamos un diálogo con el público que escuchó la excelente conferencia magistral de Niki. Bueno, creo que... ¿quiere presentar todavía? Bueno, son el conjunto de colecciones de cajas de los manuscritos de Michel Foucault, ¿no? Bueno, si da un poco de tiempo, bueno, en caso de que no hubiera preguntas, y haríamos esta cuestión de este añadido que aparece por acá en la traducción de una nota sobre el método, de cómo Niki ha logrado construir, reconstruir de manera maravillosa pues todo este proyecto que Foucault dejó inacabado de historia de la sexualidad, ¿no? Entonces, quizá aquí conviene hacer una pequeña puntualización. Niki hacía referencia en su conferencia a un manuscrito de Foucault que se llama El gobierno de sí y los otros. Quienes conocen a Foucault saben que hay un curso en el Colegio de Francia, en el Colegio de France, en donde Foucault titula justamente este curso así, El gobierno de sí y los otros, pero el manuscrito es distinto del contenido de las clases, ¿no? Entonces, por eso era en principio pues uno de los libros sobre el cristianismo. Bueno, lo comento simplemente por si no se entendió y tal, pero bueno, creo que ya por ahí hay varias manos levantadas que podrían justamente contribuir al diálogo, y bueno, pues vamos entonces a cederle la palabra al público en general para que puedan plantearle preguntas a nuestra excelente conferencista magistral, ¿no? Un trabajo impresionante en el archivo que sin duda pues nos muestra las diferentes versiones, los diferentes titubeos que Foucault tuvo a lo largo de esta elaboración de 6 volúmenes de Historia de la Sexualidad, de los cuales llegó a completar en vida 3, se acaba de publicar en 2018 el cuarto, pero que pues nos da cuenta de un pensador, un filósofo en movimiento, ¿no? No es alguien que tenga ya una verdad clara, establecida de antemano, sino que la va construyendo a lo largo del tiempo. Entonces, con este brevísimo preludio, cedo la palabra para que el público en general pueda formular las preguntas.
Gracias. Durante la conferencia me di cuenta que mencionó 3 dimensiones que me parecen muy importantes para una crítica ontológica de nosotros mismos, que decía una el poder, otra el saber y otra la subjetividad, las cuales también están muy asentadas en el pensamiento decolonial, como a través de la forma de la colonialidad del poder, la colonialidad del saber y la colonialidad del ser. Entonces, de ser posible, me gustaría saber si nos puede definir y describir cuál es la relación directa de la sexualidad con cada una de estas dimensiones, el poder, el saber y el ser o subjetividad. Gracias.
Okay, I'm going to try my best. Okay, okay, perfect. Thank you.
So he asked us about the 3 dimensions you mentioned: the power, the knowledge, and the subjectivity. And he says that those dimensions are present in the coloniality. Does that exist? Okay, coloniality. Okay, good, thank you. And in the coloniality, there's power, knowledge, and the being. So he wants to know if there's some sort of definition to describe the relation between power, knowledge, and subjectivity and sexuality. Okay, I'm going to try my best. So,
Okay.
yeah. No, this is my part.
Yes.
Okay.
The question of the question of decoloniality is so important that it's a deep shame that Foucault didn't continue his own inquiry into it, because in the archives he actually does set up the roots of modernity in colonialism and capitalism and the ravages of power. This is really his original site for thinking through power and knowledge as strategies of not just subjection in carceral society, but as global ways to distribute these forms of power that are effective precisely because they're not constricted to a particular territory. Instead, like disciplinary power more broadly, it's able to have this insidious global reach. He does, in box 12 in the archives, speak or take notes on colonialist manuals from 1840. He's aware of these histories. He's aware of the deep racisms that are involved. And unlike his usual practice, he never refers to it publicly. So I think there's something really important to be seen in the archives about what Foucault was unable to assimilate into his ideas. One, race and colonialism. Two, women and agency. And I think this is where the questions of sexuality bring those two discourses together, because in those colonialist manuals, he's talking about white men, black women. The question of race is always bound up with the question of gender. And so when thinking about how is power, knowledge, and the being connected to these questions of sexuality, it's really at the root of his own blindness when it comes to understanding subjects, modern subjects, beyond sexuality, and more towards this question that he comes to of ethics and self-relation. All to say, through 1981, through his whole life, he's unable to actually address this question for himself. And this is part of why the feminist critiques and decolonialist critiques of Foucault, from Membe to Boulanger, are so necessary today.
I'm going to try my best. Okay, so, entonces ella nos comenta que en los archivos que ella revisó existen cierta información acerca del tema, pero que no fue una información que él pudiera trabajar. Nos comenta que estos conceptos son conceptos globales que se integran en este alcance. También nos dice que, que en estos archivos existe la historia de algunos componentes que se pueden encontrar y que es importante que se tomen en cuenta ciertos elementos que tiene sobre raza y colonia, sobre las mujeres negras, y que también es una crítica que se le realiza a Foucault, que para 1981 él no pudo trabajar completamente estas ideas.
Bueno, sí, bueno, primero agradecer al comité organizador por traernos esta magistral conferencia, este evento tan importante acá en la ciudad de Morelia, en la Universidad de Michoacán, y desde luego a la doctora Niki por su extraordinaria ponencia, que nos muestra un panorama general de la obra de Foucault y nos hace verlo, pienso, un poco menos idealizado o academizado, sino una lectura un poco más cercana al personaje. Quisiera centrarme en una parte muy específica de su conferencia, y es en relación a una posible relación entre el pensamiento de Foucault y el psicoanálisis. Usted mencionó que como parte de la confesión se pensaba al psicoanálisis, si lo entendí bien, como una especie de actualización de la confesión, y quería preguntar por esa parte, porque en el campo del psicoanálisis me parece que esta crítica de Foucault, si bien original y novedosa, me parece que no va a ser bien recibida. Me parece que sobre todo por Lacan va a generar mucha incomodidad, mucho malestar y también respuesta de Lacan. No viene al caso que yo mencione la respuesta de Lacan, la menciono en un texto que es una entrevista que se llama La dificultad de vivir, pero digamos que Lacan no está de acuerdo con esta crítica Foucaultiana al psicoanálisis pensándolo como una confesión. No me aguanto de decir realmente por qué. Por el inconsciente. En el inconsciente no habría recuerdos de vivencias, sino recuerdos de fantasías. Perdón, no recuerdos, sino formaciones de fantasías, todo esto. Entonces yo quisiera ver si en los archivos de Foucault se profundiza más sobre esta crítica o sobre esta relación al psicoanálisis, que repito, va a ser tomada a mal, al menos por Lacan y por todos los lacanianos, desde luego, esta crítica que se le hace al psicoanálisis. Y la segunda, en su conferencia también mencionó que hubo un momento en el que Foucault leyó a Freud y a Descartes mencionó también. ¿Qué dijo de Freud? ¿Qué le interesa? Un poco me preguntas por la relación entre el pensamiento de Foucault y el psicoanálisis. Gracias nuevamente por su extraordinaria conferencia.
Good. One more time. He has two questions. The first one is, first of all, he wants to thank you. This is a really interesting topic. And he wants to address the fact that these kind of texts make Foucault less idealized, more real, more close to a normal person. And also, he wants to know if there is an approach of Foucault to psychoanalysis, right? Yes. And if there is some sort of approach, because during the lectures, there's a point where you mention the confession and the confession as a way to reach psychoanalysis. And he wants to know if another time there's a way to find these links of Foucault and psychoanalysis. That's the first question.
So the way that Foucault relates to psychoanalysis is very interesting, especially in his occlusion of Lacan, right? He just so rarely engages Lacan. There's a story that Henri Paul Foucault's nephew told me where Foucault gets invited to Lacan's seminar in 1966, right after The Order of Things is published, and Lacan just completely trashes him. So there is some bad blood, let's say. But there's also the different ways in which Foucault is really treated. And it's a too large part of the problem in modern society for him to let lie, and that's why he goes back to antiquity to make sense of the historical conditions of the emergence that we can then critique and break apart in order to do differently.
Disculpe. Bueno. Perdón.
Voy a contestar esta parte. Ajá. Bueno, un poquito. Bueno, en los archivos de Foucault existen diferentes elementos biológicos relativos al psicoanálisis y es una relación que hace un poquito de falta directamente a Freud. También Foucault necesita tener cuidado con lo que trataba sobre los deseos interiores y lo que se desea o lo que se confiesa, algo muy similar a las prácticas que tienen los monjes. Y como esta perspectiva un poquito más moderna del psicoanálisis también es un desafío al análisis y al decir la verdad que tiene un componente histórico. El psicoanálisis es una parte del proceso que tenía Foucault, aunque no lo admitía como tal, y también se considera una parte de la sociedad moderna. Y básicamente ahí también contesta la pregunta número 2 sobre el enfoque de Freud, puesto que Foucault fue invitado a una de las reuniones de psicoanálisis en los 1900 y algo, en 1966. Ajá, y existen diferentes maneras de trabajar que se ven reflejadas en el trabajo de Foucault durante los 70s y los 80 sobre todo en materia de lingüística.
Bueno, yo voy a tratar de hablar o más bien de practicar un poco, bueno, mis preguntas, pero más que nada las voy a tratar de, ¿cómo se dice? Pues de practicarlo, pero en inglés más que nada. Yes, well, I want to ask, sorry, do you are from United States?
Oh, yes.
Sí. Sí, es de Estados Unidos.
Thanks.
Sí. Yo vine de California, so I'm from California, born and raised Bay Area, NorCal.
Ajá, viene de California, chica californiana.
I did my studies in New York, Boston, and Providence.
Ajá, ella estudió en Boston y en Nueva York.
And have lived in Houston, Third Coast, for 10 years, going back and forth between Paris for the last 5, as much as possible.
Y bueno, ahora ella está trabajando en Houston, pero en Francia los últimos 5 años ha estado yendo y viniendo para hacer este trabajo.
Thanks. Gracias.
Buenos días. Al final comentaba sobre esto que nos dice para el presente, todo este análisis que hace Foucault sobre el pasado. Y es interesante sobre todo porque Foucault escribe muy poco sobre el presente, por ejemplo, pensando en el nacimiento de la biopolítica. En ese sentido, retomo un poco el planteamiento que se hacía sobre el tema del cuidado de sí. Desde ciertas, algunas corrientes psicoanalíticas, sobre todo lacanianas, han intentado pensar pues una especie de psicoanálisis Foucaultiano, retomando esta idea del psicoanálisis como un cuidado de sí. Desde lo que tú, lo que usted desarrolla, cree que eso Foucault lo vería como viable, por un lado, y por otro lado, pensando en su presente de Foucault, ¿él qué prácticas veía como sociales en ese sentido que pudieran plantear este cuidado de sí? Lo planteo sobre todo porque, contemporáneamente se ha retomado este discurso sobre el estoicismo y que pues entra dentro de estas visiones como muy capitalistas neoliberales, entonces que entran dentro de esta visión Foucaultiana como un escritor neoliberal. Entonces, ¿qué podría decirnos sobre eso?
So at the end of this lecture, you were commenting on what this analysis tells us for the present, and it does. It's interesting, especially because it writes very little about. He wrote very little about the present. He was always writing about his past. No, Foucault. So starting with the birth of biopolitics, in this sense, he took up a little bit of the approach that was made on the subject of the care of the self. I think it's the translation. And from certain psychoanalysis currents. So taking up this idea of psychoanalysis and the self-care, what do you think is like the practices, the social practices that we could have today of this care of the self, especially because, I don't know, we are talking about the Stoicism, I think it's the translation, sorry. And then, these visions of neoliberal capitalism. And so what would you tell us about that? How do you think he would observe this? If it would be viable, maybe, right now, to have these practices?
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, it's totally on point that Foucault rarely talks about the present in his works. He is certainly living in his present through his activism, and he is also a policy commentator. So there's a way in which he's both very much in his present, while his philosophy is about looking at the conditions of possibility for it. This is in part because he refused to prescribe answers, give answers, tell people how to vote, how to live. And so he flees from the present, I think, in his books a lot. The question of what practices can we take up requires that we parse the question of self-care today, the one that is very neoliberal, right? You need to treat yourself well by buying commodities and experiences, from the question of care of the self and others in antiquity that captivated Foucault because it showed that it's not about the kind of capitalist exchange of goods and services that is about supporting yourself at the expense of the world. Instead, it's about deepening your engagement with others. So care of the self both requires a sense of being supported and sustained by others in intimate relations, and it also responds in turn to what are the ways in which norms, notably for money, glory, and honor, need to be rejected in favor of cultivating a philosophical way of life with others, precisely so that you can see when things are really messed up politically. This is the real stake for Paresia. Paresia is about forging a whole way of life that is a contest to norms and authorities to show that how people live is not the only way to do it. And that's why Paresia, as the franc parler, where Plato is speaking out against the tyrant, is a specific moment of Paresia. It's where he's able to challenge the tyrant even when he knows he's putting himself at risk. It's not just about speaking out and the injustice, though. It's also about modeling a different way of life. And for Foucault, in his own moment, this was being a gay man, right, forging friendship as a way of life. Not just sex, it's also intimacy between others in kinds of community that weren't possible and legible before. So the self-care model is the one that is bound up in the very logics of neoliberalism and capitalism that I'm very convinced he would critique. The question of care of self and others is the site of ethical formation and transformation that I think politically are so important to him and how he lived. And so too can we see from the archives how he theorized.
Pues sí, raramente en realidad no escribía él acerca del presente, sino más bien del pasado, pero creo que él vivía el presente a través de su activismo, ¿no? Y creo que en gran parte de por qué hacía esta filosofía hacia el pasado es porque él se negaba completamente a prescribir respuestas y a decirle a la gente cómo vivir, cómo votar, qué hacer. Creo que la visión neoliberal que tenemos hoy en día de para tratarte bien tienes que adquirir comodidades y tener como pues muchas cosas muy fáciles a expensas del mundo, se refiere más bien, Foucault lo vería como una especie de comprometerte con otras personas, de tener relaciones más íntimas con los otros, con las otras personas, tratar de hacer más alusión al honor, a la gloria, más que a la gloria, perdón, y cultivar pues esta forma de vida, ¿no? más filosófica. Creo que esto es, él no era tratar de enseñar lo que es la forma de vida, sino pues hacerlo realmente, o sea, no es hablar de lo que se debe hacer, sino hacer lo que está bien. Incluso él comentaba que podía hacerse un reto a los tiranos a pesar de las consecuencias que se podían tener, y creo que este es un sitio de creo que esta forma de liberalismo y capitalismo él la criticaría, ¿no? Sin duda, y es un sitio, es un lugar de transformación y de formación que políticamente pues para él era muy importante, y podemos ver ahora en los archivos cómo teorizó esta parte y cómo podríamos aterrizarlo a la actualidad.
Hola, hi. I would like to thank you for your work because I think that it's in the order of necessity. Because I work Foucault as a founder of discursivity. So when you have a person that has founded campo de discursividad, quiero decir, pero no sé decirlo. Cuando tenemos a alguien que funda un campo de discursividad, we are always returning to them for something. So, for example, I practice psychoanalysis. So we have, for example, with Freud, we don't have that problem because all his letters are published, all his work, Strachey made it, so it's beautiful. We can access to that. And with Lacan, we had the problem of Jacques Alain Miller, that he blocks, he wipes out stuff. There's a lot of intrigue on that. So I think that your work is in the order of necessity. And I have a lot of questions, but the one that I would like to do is like, how do you think your work changed the whole work, the whole obra, no sé decir obra, the whole work of Foucault as we understand it, because it was even his question in what is an author, like what do we count as part of the work, what do we wipe out? And I would like to ask that question: why do you think he was that severe with himself? Because he didn't want the public to see this research, right? He I understand it it was covered up. So how will you think your work will change how we approach to him? So that's my question. Thank you.
Oh no, that was good.
Which one?
Okay. So this is part of the response. It's not me saying it's going to change things; it's others. So I've just been there doing the work quietly, anonymously for many years, and it's through these collaborations with people now all over the world that I think we can do this work collectively. The archives, as I said, are chaos. And in the 115 boxes, they're not organized chronologically or conceptually. So part of my work has been to reorganize the archives. And this was my first attempt to organize the boxes, the 115 boxes, chronologically, as well as a bit conceptually. And so this is a way that now you can both get a quick snapshot of what he did keep. He kept all this material. He didn't throw it away. And you can also see how much of his archives are in the 1980s. The last row altogether. And then in that second row, the History of Sexuality series just occupies just dozens and dozens and dozens of boxes. It really is his central obsession. So I think that the work that we're all doing, including Juan, in the archives, is to show what is there in order to be able to publish it and let others know so that we can correct our interpretations of Foucault. And so we can also critique Foucault because his epistemic limitations are such that 40 years later, we better do something better with Foucault. So the task is one that has to be collaborative, but the opening that I'm doing in the small book is to basically give people a map so that you can go into the archives and find yourself what kinds of concepts and categories you want to see and take up. And then conceptually, I think that we need to take seriously Foucault's own understanding of himself and his work, saying that this is what I've always been trying to do. And his intellectual journals from 1963 bear this out. The problematics of Hacia, of spiritual exercise, are actually found in intellectual notebooks in 1963. That Horacio Herrera and then Gabriel Pachowski and then I were trying to find through the years. And so there's no periodizing Foucault. Instead, there's this way that we can now use Foucault's own articulation of his work as a prism through which to understand his work over time, why it develops the way it does, how the stakes are so clearly present for him in his present, so present that he can't prescribe what to do, but instead encourages other people to take up this same critical practice to do the historical and the philosophical inquiries that only together will allow us to rethink our current moment. Bueno.
Bueno, esa la aclaración la hago yo, nota de traductor. En la parte del escrito viene la parte de la metodología, que es mucho de lo que está hablando ella. Pero nos comenta que parte de lo que trató este trabajo es de todo lo material que tuvo en el archivo. Cuando ella llega al archivo, el archivo es un caos, como pueden ver en la presentación. Y para poderlo trabajar, ella tuvo que reorganizar las cajas, tomando en cuenta que las cajas de la última fila eran las cajas que llevaban el trabajo de su última década, pero el material relacionado con la historia de la sexualidad son muchísimas cajas dentro del archivo, muchísima información. Ella trató primero de organizarlo de manera cronológica para que esto le diera una oportunidad de tener un contexto de todo el material y poderlo trabajar de esta forma. También este entendimiento del material que tiene Foucault abre la puerta a que se pueda criticar su trabajo y poder entender un poquito más la manera en la que él trabajaba teniendo esta información. También en este libro que ella va a publicar tiene esta información que ella recopiló durante estos últimos años y sobre todo en las referencias a la aparecía y los trabajos que hizo durante este periodo. También nos maneja que los trabajos, este trabajo nos invita a poderlo conocer y conocer los materiales que hay dentro de los archivos.
Hola, muy buenos días. Muchas gracias, doctora Niki. Me siento muy afortunado de estar frente a alguien y estar en este momento aquí con todos, escuchándola. Alguien que conoce tan a profundidad todo este material inédito de Foucault y que se dio la tarea de organizar y sistematizar. Muchas gracias. Yo tengo una inquietud acerca de este viraje que hace Foucault de la sexualidad, me parece, a las prácticas de sí. Y en ese viraje, me perdonarán un poco los seguidores de Freud, pero noto que para Foucault, esa es mi impresión, la sexualidad no es tan constituyente del sujeto, sino más bien todo este sistema de prácticas. Mi duda es si en las cajas existe alguna pista de si Foucault, en este entendimiento de lo que somos nosotros mismos, apuntaba a seguir esta pista de las prácticas de sí, pero ya no solo desde los griegos y los romanos, sino hacia, no sé, hacia los periodos que siguieron. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Dr. Niki. I feel very fortunate to be here and with all these people listening to someone who has taken the time of organizing this archive. I have a concern about this trip that Foucault makes from sexuality, it seems to me, to the practice of the self. And maybe the followers of Freud will not be very happy with me. That's my impression. But I think that for Foucault, sexuality is not much of a constituent of the subject, but rather this whole system of practices. So my question is whether in the boxes, is there any clue to understand what we maybe want to for ourselves to follow these practices, or the clue of the practices of the self, but not only to what the Greeks and the Romans were doing towards, but not more the periods that follow. Mm-hmm.
So, I take two different questions away from there. So I'll start with the second, which is the question of practices. Because I hear in the background, the concern, the worry for how it seems like Foucault is escaping from modernity, going back to the past, escaping from sexuality in the present, and retreating into what are elite male ethics in this care of the self. And therefore, to what extent are these practices relevant for how we think about ethics and practices of the self today? So the part there that I want to take up is how Foucault in the archives is developing his readings of antiquity with great depth and rigor around these questions of aphrodisia, eros, sophrosune, the various practices in the care of the self, because for him it allows for a different way of thinking about the relation to the self than modern sexuality, where the relation to self is always mediated through an authority, and it's about the rejection and renunciation of the self vis-a-vis one's own sexual desires. He sees a different experience in antiquity, a different experience of the self, where you can take up practices in a different way that challenge norms and that link together two different philosophical injunctions. One, know thyself, the noti soton, and two, care of the self, care for thyself. For him, he's saying that the subject of knowledge also needs to be the subject of action. And that's to say, you can't know something unless you're doing it, and you can't do it unless you have some kind of guiding discourse. This is what he sees as separating in early Christianity and through the development of the modern West, where between Cashin and Descartes, the subject of action falls away, and instead we are only left with the subject of knowledge, an interior cogito. So this is the way in which he sees the practices changing over time in a way that are going to become more oriented towards the renunciation of self. And this is part of why in antiquity he wants to see how is self-transformation also possible. And I think that's a really great opening conceptually, even though we also need to recognize that he's dealing with extreme privilege. He's dealing with, the top 1%. And so how is this really a care for others? This is the work that we need to do. It's not work that he himself was able to get to.
Veo dos preguntas un poco diferentes acá en esta. Entonces, Foucault, pues en los archivos está desarrollando estos temas con la antigüedad y con gran profundidad y con gran rigor en torno a estas cuestiones, las prácticas del cuidado, las prácticas éticas del cuidado de sí. Para él permite una forma de pensar la relación con el sí o con el yo diferente a la sexualidad moderna, y la relación con uno mismo que está mediada por una autoridad, y en estos, se trata de un poco, entiendo, un rechazo a una renuncia. Son los deseos de uno, los propios deseos sexuales de uno. Ve una experiencia diferente de la antigüedad a la experiencia que es del sí, donde se adoptan prácticas de manera que desafían ciertas normas y que unen dos mandatos filosóficos diferentes. El primero es me parece, perdón, es que dijo el nombre en francés y no alcancé a captarlo.
El conocimiento de sí, el cuidado de sí.
Gracias, el conocimiento de sí, el cuidado de sí. Y bueno, también tiene que ser algo que no puedes saber. Estas prácticas cambian con el tiempo, y lo que dicen es que no puedes saber lo que estás haciendo, y no puedes hacerlo a menos de que tengas algún tipo de guía, ¿no? Para poder llevarlo a cabo. Esto es lo que él ve como una separación en el cristianismo primitivo y a través del desarrollo del occidente moderno, donde entra, creo, Descartes. El sujeto de la acción se aleja y en lugar de eso vemos el conocimiento y el interior, y es la forma en la que ve que las prácticas cambian con el tiempo de una manera que, bueno, vamos a estar más orientados hacia una renuncia en sí misma, y es parte como la autotransformación también es posible, y esto da una apertura muy amplia conceptualmente. Menciona que esta es la forma en la que las prácticas cambian con el tiempo, y tenemos que reconocer que está lidiando con un gran privilegio porque es el 1% más rico con el que se está lidiando. Entonces, cómo esto es realmente un cuidado de sí o un cuidado de los demás, este es el trabajo que pues tendríamos que estar haciendo. Gracias.
Bueno, por cuestiones de tiempo vamos a tener que cortar el diálogo aquí, en este punto. Tenemos una mesa enseguida, pero bueno, podemos, si así lo decide nuestra conferencista magistral, pues abordarla los pasillos para plantear las preguntas que tengamos, ¿no? Todavía, bueno, no sé si habrá disposición de las traductoras para quedarse un poquito más. Tenemos por esta cuestión logística que suspender aquí el diálogo, pero bueno, pues no sin antes agradecerles a todos ustedes que vinieron a escuchar esta conferencia magistral en inglés, con las traducciones al español, y que bueno, de manera maravillosa, verdaderamente magistral, nos ha presentado la doctora Niki Kasumi Clements, ¿no? Entonces, pues pueden ver, le agradecemos